But thank you for the invitation to speak here. This is exciting. We are approaching Easter, so I guess some of you might be focusing on some of those spiritual disciplines that Nathan mentioned earlier because of Lent. And a lot of the spiritual disciplines, if any of you are going through them, are really wrapped up in this passage that we are looking at today in Luke 4. So there's a bit of solitude in there, there's a bit of prayer in there, there's a bit of fasting in there, all those kinds of things that a lot of people do as spiritual disciplines during this season of the year. And so that's partly why I chose this passage in preparation for that, if some of you are going through that about the temptation of Jesus. And so as we read that passage, we realize that what some of you may be doing, Jesus was one of our predecessors in that. And so some of your exercises might even be based on this passage. And so as we look at the temptation that happens to Jesus today, we're focusing on the strategies of the tempter. And I was really interested in hearing the way it was described in the Bible reading that you used, in the translation you used. It was every trick in the book. Satan tried every trick in the book. And I thought that's fantastic, because that's exactly what we're focusing on today. We're looking at, well, what are the tricks? What are the tricks in the book? And what are some of the really common ones that we can look out for and help us in our own struggles that we go through? The Apostle Paul looks at this as well. He looks at, in 2 Corinthians, he says that he's writing in order that the Satan might not outwit us, for we are not unaware of his schemes. In other words, we know what the tricks are. So we should look out for the tricks, and that'll help us. And that's really the basis of what we're going to do today. We're going to look at what some of those tricks are. Now, a little bit of housekeeping. Nathan has spent some time in the past talking to you as a congregation about how we should refer to the tempter. Some people view the Satan as a personal being, others as an impersonal being. I'm not going to get into that today. Nathan's already covered it. It's not the purpose of our time, but if you want to listen to some of his sermons about it, they're on your website there, and I'm sure he can tell you which ones they are. But just to be aware today that when we use the word Satan or the Satan or the devil or the tempter, I'm just going to kind of use them all interchangeably, and you'll be able to engage with those in whatever context that you're familiar with in how you think of the tempter. And so in Luke 4, we see Jesus goes out into the wilderness. Now, the wilderness is not a nice place. If you believe the internet, they've got a monastery built there. This is kind of what it looks like there. This is generally what people consider of here as the Judean wilderness. This is the place that we're talking about. It's renowned as one of the most inhospitable places on the earth. It's full of scorpions and snakes and wild beasts, and there's no water there. And so what a lot of people see is that in the temptation of Jesus, they see a real deliberate contrast to the first temptation that's recorded in the Bible. So if you think about Jesus as the second Adam, which he's referred to in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, then we compare that with the first temptation with the first Adam. Well, Jesus' temptation was in this dry, horrible wilderness, which is the worst of circumstances. The first temptation happened in the opposite circumstances, in a beautiful, lush garden with plenty of water. And what we're trying to look at is the way that the results of those two temptations are just as contrasting as the circumstances. And what we want to notice today is that while the circumstances were very different and the results were very different, the strategy of the tempter was actually very similar. As we look at the strategy of the Satan in Matthew 4 and Luke 4 and Mark 1, and we compare it with what happened in the garden, we can learn some things about the Satan's schemes and the tricks that he's using to try and trap us. And so trick number one, scheme number one is this: the one thing that you don't have is better than everything God's given you already. And we see this in the temptation of turning the stones to bread. So in this part of the story, when the Satan offers Jesus the bread, Jesus actually had everything he could want at that moment. He had everything he could want, except he was really hungry. He was spiritually full. He was feeling close to God. All those things were lined up and in place. And the Satan was trying to point out that, well, sure, God's given you a lot. You're spiritually full. You're feeling close to God. But don't look at that. Let's turn over here and let's look at the one thing that you don't have, which is food. God is not looking after you properly. And we see the same thing happen in Genesis chapter 3 with Adam and Eve. They had the whole garden, everything God had given them, but there was one thing that wasn't given to them. And so the Satan focused on that and offered them the one tree. But they already had the whole garden. They had tons of trees. Why did they need one more? And so this is the scheme. This is the trick to convince us that the one thing we don't have is better than everything we already have, everything that God's given us. And the Satan wants to get us to focus on that one thing and allow that to become everything. Now that trick, that scheme is very similar to the scheme or trick number 2. This number 2 trick is that he tempts us with what we already have. And this is when the Satan promises Jesus that I'll give you the world. He promises something that Jesus already has. Now, the Bible does tell us that the Satan is the prince of the world. So yes, in one way, if Satan was the prince of the world, then Jesus didn't have it. But Jesus owned the world before the Satan, and he entrusted it to people to look after. But then the Satan got in control of things, didn't he? And you notice in verse 6, it says, it was given to me. The Satan acknowledges that. He says, the world was given to me and I can give it to you. But who gave the world to the Satan? Well, God gave that to the Satan, didn't he? Jesus gave that to the Satan. So what exactly was the Satan trying to offer Jesus? The devil was trying to tempt Jesus with something that he already had and that he got from Jesus in the first place. And we see that also in Genesis chapter 3 with Eve. The Satan says to Eve, when you eat of the tree, you'll be like God. Well, guess what? She was already like God. The Bible tells us in Genesis 1:27 that Adam and Eve were made in the image of God. So she was already like God. But what did the Satan tempt her with? Oh, you need to become like God. She was already like God. And that's the second trick of the devil, the second temptation. And this thing often happens to us. So if we can watch out for it, it can be a little bit helpful. So next time you're feeling tempted with something, try to just pause, just stop for a moment and try and search your heart. Look for something that's happening a level deeper underneath the immediate obvious temptation. Just see if you can peel back the curtain a bit, peel back the layers and see what's the deeper motivation or the deeper desire that is giving that temptation its power. You'll probably notice that the thing you're being tempted with, something you've already got, but it's disguised in a different way. I'll give you an example of it. For me, if I'm getting frustrated or angry at home, usually it's because I want some peace and quiet. I want some peace and quiet. I feel like I'm not getting it. And so I get frustrated and I get angry because this is my rest time. I want to watch the footy or something like that. And I get upset if the kids are disturbing me, particularly when they were younger. But the reality is that if I wasn't making a scene right now, the noise would have probably disappeared already. And I would have the peace and quiet that I wanted, that I'm now angry about and I'm making a fuss about, so there's no peace and quiet for anybody. And so if we look at that situation and look a little deeper into it, I don't actually crave quietness. I'm getting upset because it's not quiet, but I don't crave quietness. What I really crave is happiness. And happiness was already happening, wasn't it? The noise that the kids were making, that was them being happy. They were having a great time playing the Xbox or running around outside or running into the room playing hide and seek or whatever they were doing. They were happy. And as a father, that should make me happy. But the trick is that I find that I don't have something that I want, which I'm calling peace. What I really wanted was happiness, which I had all along. And so we get tempted with something that we already have. And so we've got to watch out for that kind of thing. All of us do. And so then trick number 3, scheme number 3, is really focused on our pride. This is where the Satan says to Jesus, jump off the pinnacle. Now, something that we don't always know and notice is that this temptation, that this challenge to jump off the pinnacle was something that a previous Messiah had done and jumped off and landed on the ground and went splat, and that was the end of his attempts to be the Messiah. And so this is something which was kind of common knowledge at the time. And so the Satan is saying, well, you would actually be successful, Jesus. And it's an attack on his pride. And he starts out by trying to create a bit of doubt in Jesus. And he says, if you are the Son of God, you'll be able to jump off here and God will take care of you and it'll all be all right. The Satan starts this scheme by trying to create doubt where there is no doubt. We've got to watch out for that too. And if you look at it, does the Satan think that Jesus has forgotten who he is? If you are the Son of God. Why does Jesus need to prove himself to anyone? He doesn't. Now, obviously, in the story in the Bible, Jesus doesn't fall for it. But we do. We fall for it all the time. I've got a friend who's got a kid who, when that friend was a teenager, one of the little games this guy played for about 3 months is when he would come over to visit my kids, he'd say something really ridiculous like, you know, if you dip the knife in the butter, some butter will come out. And he would say, prove it. Or if you said anything just really obvious, like if you open the fridge, there'll be, you know, your lunch in there. And he wouldn't do it. He'd just say, prove it. And he'd kind of antagonize you and try and get you to get in this debate with him to prove something that there was no need to prove. And that's kind of what Satan's doing here. The Satan's saying, well, prove this thing, and there's no need to prove it. And we often fall for that. Often our anger or our frustration or our impatience or many of our wrong attitudes come from trying to prove ourselves to others, to ourselves, to anyone. Why do we have to prove ourselves to anyone? Especially the tempter. And so when we try to prove ourselves, instead of resting in God, being at peace in his love, the end result is anger and frustration and pride in trying to prove ourselves. And as we were going through some of your rituals today, I was just wondering if that was the point of one of them, where it's saying you're forgiven, just rest in that and be at peace in that. I think that's exactly what that little ritual was trying to reassure us all of as you went over and over and over again with every individual person. It's actually combating this temptation of the devil to prove yourselves. We don't have to. We just rest in what we've been forgiven from. Something that we do know, and psychologists will tell us, that our anger is often fear in disguise. When people struggle with emotions like anger and some other things like that, psychologists will often begin by helping them look for things they're afraid of. Because if you can figure out what you're afraid of, you can figure out where your anger comes from. And the Satan wants to make us afraid. How does the tempter make us afraid? He starts by saying, if this, and as soon as we listen to if, we get afraid. If God loves you, if God cares, if God's in control, if God is true and trustworthy. And it's the same in the Garden of Eden in Genesis 3:1. Did God really say you must not eat from any tree in the garden? The tempter tries to sow these seeds of doubt and then spots a weakness and then works on that weakness and makes the weakness grow. And with Eve, the weakness was that the tempter tried to work on the way that she said God forbade them to touch the tree. Why would she say that? Well, maybe there was a little bit of fear in there. And so the Satan works on the fear and expands on it to create more fear and more doubt. Because God didn't say don't touch the tree. God said don't eat the tree. But maybe there was a bit of fear, so, well, let's not touch the tree. And that little doubt is what the tempter works on. And then the tempter's task is nearly complete, just works on that and can sit back and watch what the fear does. So these three common traps of the Satan. What is the answer to them? Well, the answer to all of these schemes is to keep our hearts and our eyes focused on God. All the schemes focus on our insecurities. And so it's very interesting and important to notice something that happens right before the temptation of Jesus. The temptation happens in chapter 4, but look at what happens in chapter 3. Just before the temptation is the baptism. And in the baptism, you'll notice there's a really strong and a really wonderful affirmation of Jesus. In the baptism, God says to Jesus, "You are my son who I love. With you I am well pleased." That affirmation is so important right before a temptation. Personally, I know that I'm the most vulnerable to temptation when I'm feeling bad about myself. It's a very common thing. If you watch your own emotions and patterns for a while, you'll probably notice something similar happening in yourself. It talks about how many Christians struggle with temptation because we don't enjoy life as much as God wants us to. And interestingly, the people that are accused of that the most are the Baptists, which is kind of us, right? But this writer, he talks about the verse that says, "The joy of the Lord is your strength." He says the key is that we are going to be tempted when we're unhappy. That's why the joy of the Lord is your strength. And so he says we must arrange our lives so that sin no longer looks good to us. And he writes about this in a book on spiritual disciplines, and he's looking at fasting and solitude and all these kinds of tough disciplines. And then he has a chapter on this spiritual discipline that he calls celebration, the discipline of having fun, because that helps you resist sin better. Why are we stronger when we're joyful? Well, because if we're already having a good time, sin doesn't look as attractive to us. If you're having a fantastic time doing the right thing, you won't have a great desire to do the wrong thing. And that's one of the reasons why the joy of the Lord is your strength. We need to arrange life so that sin no longer looks good to us. So what we find is that all of the strategies of the tempter that we looked at today are about taking away our joy. The tempter wants us to feel sad when we focus on the one thing that we don't have instead of all the wonderful things that God's already given to us. The tempter wants us to feel tired and unmotivated when we struggle and struggle and struggle to gain what we already had anyway. And the tempter wants to make us afraid when doubt starts to cloud our minds, which leads to all kinds of self-doubt and weakness after that. And so we need to focus on and be thankful for and enjoy to the fullest the wonderful gifts that God's already given us. And we need to focus on what God says about us, not worry about what others say about us or worry about our own self-doubt. And if we can do that, well, then we're well on the way to following Jesus' footsteps in defeating temptation and living the kinds of fuller and more joyful lives that he intends for us. And so that's what I think we learn from this passage that you've looked at today in your reading leading into Lent. So hopefully that's a little bit helpful to you. And I'm going to hand back to Nathan to continue with the rest of your service. But thank you for the privilege of speaking here today. I'm glad to be asked. So thank you.